Welcome, Dr. Magnus. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for inviting me. It's always fun to talk about space stuff.
Well, I'd love to jump into our first topic, and what I'm most curious about is the moments before your big astronaut interview. I'm wondering what you were thinking and the mindset that you were embracing.
Well, actually, I'm going to take you back even a little bit before I went down to the interview because the real moment, or the moment when it all became real, the possibility that I may actually get to be an astronaut, was when I got a call for the interview. When they called and said, "Hey, we want you to come interview." And at that moment, my brain was just, it was actually the first time I think I've ever been hysterical in my whole life, right? Because it meant, when I got the phone call, it meant everything that I needed to do in order to achieve my goal, I was successful at. That somebody down at Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, thought that I could do the job, and they wanted to talk to me about it. At that point, everything was going to be out of my control. Like when you interview for a job anywhere, you have no idea what they're looking for. I didn't know if my eyes were going to be good enough. I didn't know. I mean, at that point, it was all out of my control. But the part that was in my control, I was successful at. So I got off the phone, and I was jumping and screaming and crying and shouting. I was just completely hysterical. So I kind of approached the interview with the mindset, okay, I'm going to go down to Johnson. They want to interview me. Awesome. They interview 120 people every year. So I knew it was, you get there, you meet these, they had 20 people at a time down in each interview group, because the interview is not just the actual interview, it's a lot of medical testing too. And I'm looking around at this group of people. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is an amazing group of people. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to have them, I'm going to go into the interview, and I'm going to make sure they put a face to the paper, because they have a stack of paper about this big on that point. And that means that next time I'll be in really good shape, because they'll know who I am. So I was just, it's really important in any interview to be yourself. And of course I was nervous. We were all nervous, but it was so exhilarating to meet 19 other people who I shared this dream with, that the whole week was just a lot of fun. But I was kind of going into it like, okay, this is my first round of interviews. I'm going to get my face to the paper, and then 2 years from now, I'll come back and have a better shot. But then I got selected, so it was all good.
Wow, that is so incredible. And so, in your journey, then living in that dream and then going on your trip to the ISS, I'm curious about the mindset that you embraced in knowing that you would be separated and isolated from society for a little bit. And while this journey was so exciting, I'm curious how you prepared yourself for that.
Yeah, it's funny you asked that question, because early in COVID, it became a thing to hunt down astronauts and talk to us about our isolated lifestyle. And I was like, we were never really isolated in COVID. You could go outside, you could order pizza, you could go to, it's funny. But the missions that we do, you're very much in a mission mindset, right? Whether it's a short shuttle mission or it's a long duration space station mission, you're like, okay, I've got this mission. This mission is going to last 10 days. This mission is going to last 6 months. In the case of Scott Kelly, this mission is going to last a year. And so that's what's in your head, and you're very focused on the mission. So the isolation piece, I never really felt isolated, because I had a job to do. I was doing my job. And we have a lot of connectivity on board the space station, even more now than when I was there, 12, 13 years ago, because at the time when I was up there, I had email available, so I could email with my friends and family on a pretty fluid basis. Every weekend we had a video conference with our family as well on Sunday for, however long you wanted it to go. And then we have a phone. We could make phone calls from space, and people loved getting phone calls from space. Like, there was a little bit of a lag on the connection, and I'd call somebody and they'd pick it up and say hello, and right away I'd say, "This is space calling," But now they have, Twitter. So now the crews on board can engage in social media, and that also makes you feel less isolated. But it's really all about doing the mission. There are hundreds, if not thousands of people on the ground who are counting on you to do your job up there. And so you're just very, very focused. And to your training question, we get tons of training. I mean, I trained for 4.5 years before I went on space station, and they've managed to squeeze that time frame down to 2.5, but you get extensive training on what you're going to be doing on orbit.
I love how the connectivity and the increase in connectivity over the years has facilitated that connection to people on the ground even more so. And I believe it's also helped with a little more of that work-life integration. And so I'm curious, in between all of your trips and in the process during the trainings, how did you balance the life in between all of this exciting, dream fulfilling work?
Yeah, it's funny. I'm a big proponent of work-life balance. And in any job that you have, you're always going to have moments where your head's down, working intensely, and you're going to have moments where you can have a little bit more of I don't want to say lazy, but more of an easier flow to your work
Yes.
style, right? And so that's with any job. With ours, it was the same. It was the same way, right? When we were training, though, they tried to keep the work-life balance well managed, because we work during the day. Occasionally we have to work in the evening in sims, but the training was actually pretty straightforward because it was very scheduled. It was like almost being in school again, because you go in and it's like, okay, from 8 to 9 you're going to go learn about eclipse, and from 9 to 10 you're going to go do the sim, and from 10 to 12 you're going to have medical training, then you got 20 minutes for lunch or 30 minutes for lunch. So that was actually very intense. But I think it is important to have things to do or interests outside of work. And of course, with a job like mine where it was in a passion, for those of us who are doing things that we're passionate about, which is what you should be doing. Sometimes it's easy to get too drawn in and you forget, but it's good to have outside hobbies. It's good to recognize, I think, when you might need a break, when your stress level's getting high, when your burnout level's getting high. So understanding yourself, I think, and what those signs are, is really key to managing work-life balance, and then understanding what you need to do to relieve stress. For me, it's always been exercise. Even when I was going to the space station, I told the ground controller's like, hey, I need to exercise, so I'm going to be rearranging my schedule to the extent that I need to make sure I get the exercise in, because that's going to be how I keep my stress level down and I stay in a good place. So I think you have to figure out for you, A, how to recognize when you need that balance and it's out of kilter, and then B, what you need to do to bring it back into proper balance.
Absolutely. And I can't imagine anything more motivating than someone like yourself sharing how you advocated for yourself to exercise, even up in space and with all these schedules. And I'm sure students who are maybe pushing off a workout or choosing not to take some time outside to spend some extra time on problem sets will find that really inspiring and motivational to make sure they get those steps in and get that movement in. And so, with those daily habits or routines, I was curious how the overview effect now shapes your daily life and just how you show up every day after these trips.
Yeah, and before I go to the answer to that, just one comment for students as you're trying to understand work-life balance. It really comes down to time management and discipline. If you've got a time management system and you're disciplined about following it, I suspect that you're going to find you have more time for the life balance than you suspect, because that's a skill you're learning while you're in college, especially time management and discipline. But to your point about the overview effect, it's interesting. Anybody who goes to space, and whether it's suborbital, because I've talked with several of the people who have been able to fly on Blue Origin's New Shepard, and they go up suborbital, and then basically it's a big ballistic arc. They go up, have 4 or 5 minutes, and come down. Even that altitude and that change in perception is enough to trip off what is popularly called the overview effect. And really what it is a different understanding of our planet. It's a different appreciation of our planet. Everybody who's listening to this, we're all living on the planet, and we're sitting in our rooms and our chairs in one small, tiny we're experiencing just one small, tiny aspect of the planet and the environment around us. And you realize, and you know intellectually, that the planet is much bigger and that there are people, halfway around the globe living and working, and there are, animals in Africa, and there are big rivers. And I mean, you know all this intellectually from your classes. But when you switch some knowledge from intellectual knowledge to experiential knowledge, it really makes a greater impact on your comprehension and understanding of the situation. So when we have an opportunity to go into space and see Earth from space, it really hits you. It's like, oh my gosh, our planet is beautiful. Our planet is fragile. Our planet is, for the engineers in the crowd, a closed system, which means that every action has a reaction in the system, and it's all connected. Oh my gosh, our planet is our spaceship, and we're all members of the same crew on the spaceship. And so these things can't help but, impact you, and it changes your view of how everything is so connected, and you understand it internally in a way that your brain and your academic understanding can't. It's like when for students, when you go to a class and you're learning about something, and then you go to a lab, or you're on a student project and you're applying that knowledge, you're like, oh, now I get it. It's the same thing, but much bigger.
And so with carrying that feeling and that energy, and after these trips, how did you navigate knowing what was next and what was best for you, given everything that you knew then and saw? What felt most fitting for that next step after this big dream accomplishment?
Yeah, that was really difficult, right? My whole life since middle school, all I wanted to do was be an astronaut. And I was an astronaut for 16 years. And now I was reaching, 16 years into the program, flew on the very last shuttle mission, STS-135. That was after my station mission. And now I'm looking around going, okay, what's my next step? If I stay in the office for another 10 years or so, I was 48 at the time. If I stay in the office for another 10 years or so, I'll probably get to fly again at some point, maybe as a station commander, or maybe just as, another long duration crew member. But I'm at the back of the line now because I just flew STS-135. And so I was mapping out what that career path would be. And should I stay in the office and fly one more time, or should I, maybe it's time to go do something else. So I was dealing with this on two levels, right? I was dealing with this strategically and intellectually in the course of how do I want to spend, the rest of my life? But I was also dealing with it emotionally from the viewpoint of, astronaut it's like internal to me. It's who I am. It's what I feel like. Space is my second home. It's the only thing I've ever wanted to do. And why would I think of not doing it anymore? And so I had these very two different parts of me at war. And I really had to sit down and think about what it is that makes me happy, what challenge, what makes me tick. And it's really all about having a challenge. And I had this suspicion that if I waited around in the, hung out in the astronaut office and did technical jobs, which is what we do in between flights, and to the point where I got assigned again, which might take 5, 6, 7 years, and then train for 2 years and then fly for whatever and come down. I suspected that during that 5 or 6 or 7 years or whatever it was going to be, that I wasn't going to be challenged, because the technical jobs that were in front of me were jobs I had already done. Because we just kind of wrote, it's very flat in the astronaut office, because we get technical jobs and we go fly, we come back, we get technical jobs, and you may get different technical jobs over the course of your career. And I had some great ones. And I thought, I'm going to be on a day-to-day basis a little bit unhappy, which then will make me crabby and not such a pleasant person to be around if I'm not being challenged. And so I realized that I really need to move on to go do something else. And it so intellectually it made a lot of sense. Emotionally, it took me quite a while to come around to the fact that, okay, it's, you got to let it go.
Absolutely. And what you shared about wanting to pursue something challenging rings so true for me and so many of the peers that I've met, and I'm sure so many students that you've mentored, in them seeking something that is both challenging and meaningful. And so, with that cycle, as you mentioned, between doing the technical jobs and then flying, I'm sure you've held innumerable amount of leadership positions through those 16 years. And even so now, after that dream and that journey, you lead so many things. And so I'm curious about the ways in which the overview effect and the learnings that you've had through it have now shaped your leadership style. And maybe those things are decoupled. Maybe you already had a leadership style that was developing outside of the overview effect and what you've learned from that. But I'm wondering if you could shed some light on that.
Yeah, I mean, leadership styles develop as you develop as a professional, right? Because you get put in different situations. You learn a lot from supervisors and peers. Some are things that you want to emulate. Some are things like, I don't want to be that guy, So you're learning all along. Now, what was interesting about the astronaut office, which is really unique, is that it was a very flat structure, right? So, like I mentioned before, when we get assigned to flights, we're off and we're training and we're flying and we're doing all that. And then we have technical jobs if we don't. So we're constantly moving in and out of assignments as we come in and out of flight assignments. So, for example, at one point in my career at NASA, I was the chief of the branch in the astronaut office that interfaced with the space station program on operations and crew issues. And I had several of my peers working in my branch. And then I went off to fly, so somebody else had to take over the chief job. And then when I came back from my flight, I was a worker bee in the branch, right? So this idea of moving in and out of leadership positions in such a flat structure is very unique. Usually in industry, there's like a hierarchy and it's very clear. But what you learn in a structure like that is the importance of leadership, but also the importance of followership, and also the understanding that no matter what your role is on the team, you can have a leadership position. There's a difference between a leader and a manager, and there's different ways to lead, right? And so it really opens your aperture on what leadership actually means. So I guess if you have to say that I've have a style, it's very collaborative, because the whole point of a leader is you want to get the most that you can out of your team. And so how do you do that? You make sure the team is engaged. You're not dictating to the team. I throw questions out. I'm very good at throwing questions out. And all right, you guys, here's the problem. It's also your job as a leader to bound the box, right? You can't have all the cats going everywhere else. You guys, okay, here's the box we're in. Here's the problem we're trying to solve. What do you think? And then you have a discussion, right? And the length of the discussion has a lot to do with the bounds of the box and things, but you want to make sure your whole team is engaged. And you really have to be careful not to dictate how right off the bat, right? But also as a leader, you have to be the person who's got if you have the responsibility for the final outcome, you have to make the final decision, right? Because sometimes people with collaborative leadership styles want to do consensus, they want to have committee consensus on a decision. That's not possible. Somebody has to step in and be the person that's like, okay, awesome conversation. We've covered a lot of ground. This is the way we're going to go, right? And you need to have that to get the group moving. And typically what I would do in that situation is like, okay, awesome conversation. Appreciate everybody's input. Here's what we're going to do, and here's why. Because what I find when you explain why that you've made a decision and you're sending a group off in a certain direction, it helps them understand. First of all, they know they've been listened to, and second, they can understand how you're thinking and it's like, okay, I basically I've collected all your input, I've processed it. Here's what we're going to do, and here's why, and it kind of builds on the group conversation. So those are different styles that I use. And also as the leader, it's your job. I kind of call it the Energizer Bunny. You have to provide the energy for the group, right? You're getting them all excited about what you're going to do. You've got that vision. You've got that. It's like, all right, you guys, this is why we're going to do this. And you really want to excite them, because you can't force people even in the hierarchies, the rigid hierarchies, you cannot force people to participate. You'll just get passive aggressive behavior. And so you have to excite people and motivate them to do the things that you're trying to get them to do. So hopefully that answers your question.
Absolutely. And I've, in one of your talks, heard you break down the Energizer Bunny before as well. And so it's really exciting to hear about it again. And it sort of reiterated that fact of how much energy makes a difference to driving these teams. And everything that you shared is so valuable to students listening, underrepresented folks listening who have these similar goals, and especially the difference that you stated between a leader and a manager, I think is super insightful because I hadn't considered it prior to this conversation. And it's definitely something big that I'm taking away. And in everything that you shared, I'm curious about how you approach change and whether it's still through energizing the group or if there's other things that you add. And this is particularly with respect to these research institutions and other industry practices and mentoring that you do. How do you advocate for change in these spaces now, given your position and all of these awards and being so widely respected, but sometimes maybe bringing a tougher problem forward that hasn't been done before, that you deeply believe has to be done now? I'm curious about how you move forward with change and your approach to that.
Yeah, so when I was the executive director of AIAA, change was on the table, and that's what we were having to do, right? And the first thing, again, as the leaders, you have to create the vision. It's like, here, we need to change, and we need to change to go here, right? What's the destination? But you have to be able to address the why, because I mean, we put this change forth in front of the AIAA community, and we're constantly having to remind people why we were doing it. The whole 3 years we were going through it. Why are we doing this again? Because people, there's a lot of resistance to change. And if you're trying to move up, especially a big organization, it's like, this is why we're doing it. This is why it's great for you. It's not like everything we're doing now is horrible, but the world has changed, and we need to go here. And again, that's that energizer piece. Change management is a lot of the energizer piece and getting people excited about what the vision where you're trying to get them to, and reminding them why it's important, and then starting to show a path that people can. So you have to take it out of that amorphous world and start breaking it down into piece parts so people can see the path that they're and how they're engaged in the change. Again, they want, if you're trying to get an organization to change, people want to feel like they have an input into it as well. So you figure out how to do. We did a lot of listening sessions. We had website locations where people could provide input. I ran around and talked to a lot of the community to get feedback. I mean, it takes a lot of energy, but you want to get them engaged, you want to articulate the vision, and you want to explain why. That's really helpful.
That is so incredibly helpful, especially in talking to leaders as young folks and advocating for change. Oftentimes there might be resistance or a difference in either communication styles, but what you mentioned about vision building and energizing folks is definitely something that anyone can get behind. And in casting that vision of the future that people are excited about, rather than focusing on the leap that someone has to make there from perhaps something that is more comfortable, is so interesting to me because, again, I hadn't perceived it in that way. I felt as though in communicating change in certain things, perhaps someone would have to touch on where we are now and maybe why we need to do something differently. But I love that forward focus that you mentioned, and you've had so much success in communicating this, and this is such valuable advice for students as they move through professionally and in different pursuits. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah, if I can add something real quick, as the leader, you have the idea of where you want the organization to go, You may have an idea of the path, but if you want your community engaged, they may come up with a different path. And just because it's not your path, that's okay as long as it gets you where you're going to go in the box that you drew around the problem, right? And if they're engaged in charting the path, they're going to be much more excited and energetic and proactive about getting you there. So you have to, sometimes as a leader, you have to let go of your preconceived notion about how you're going to get to your goal, and in order to engage get your community to follow you along. So there's a little bit of a push-pull there, because but you have to know what your box is. Like if they have a solution that's 2 years in the future and you have a 6-month time frame, that's clearly not going to work, right? But to the extent that you can, it's good as the leader to keep some flexibility in that conversation.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Magnus. So I'd love to shift gears a little bit and ask you about the advice that you would give to your 23-year-old self. So a lot of the people who are listening are either in university or in high school, or they're transitioning out of it and they're an early career professional. So I'm curious about the advice that you'd tell 23-year-old Dr. Magnus.
Yeah, so this is the advice I give students now. Believe in yourself, right? I remember I graduated at 21, went to work, and I was the only woman in my group, and I'm looking around going, am I smart enough to be here? I had a lot of, it was all brand new. It was all scary. Ooh, working world, do I really know enough to do this? So I think it's really easy to doubt yourself, regardless of what you're doing, when it's new and it's something you haven't done before. Which is really going to be your whole life, right? You hopefully are always doing new things in your life. It's always a little bit scary and it can be very intimidating. So I would just encourage all of you to believe in yourself and just work hard. It turns out over the years, the best people that I have worked with and that I've had work for me were people that I call point and shoot people. I can give them a task and they'll go off and they'll do the task. And I know that if they run into questions, or if they run into problems, or if they run into roadblocks, they're going to come back to me and say, hey, this thing wasn't so clear, or this new item came up, and what do you think of this? And they come back for help, right? But I know they're going to work hard. I know they're going to put some brain cells on it. I know they're going to be reliable. And I know I can count on them to work in a team environment. That's what's really important. Not that you're a 4.0 student, or you have 17 million equations in your head, or whatever, right? It's really all about, can I be a member of a team? Do I live up to what I say? Do I have a good work ethic? Do I have a good attitude? That's what makes you successful. And all of you can do that. All of you. So believe in yourself and be that person, and it'll be fine. And as long as you're doing something you're passionate about, something super interesting to you, and you're challenging yourself a little bit, it's all going to be fine.
Wow, all of this is so reaffirming to how I'm now trying to show up in meetings or teams where I am the only minority or the person that looks like me in a group of 27 men. And these all happen to be virtual calls, which I think changes how we're all presenting ourselves, because it's only really shoulders up that we're seeing. But everything that you shared will truly make such a difference of how I'll engage in some upcoming meetings I have, where I do think I have to lead it to make sure we close the loop in the right amount of time. And I will definitely be re-listening to this to make sure I get the encouragement I need. And so if it's all right with you, I'd love to ask you a couple rapid fire questions, but feel free to take a little bit more time if you need to unpack anything further. My first question is, what does wellness mean to you?
Wow, there's different components of that, right? There's physical, mental, emotional. I think it's really important, I said this earlier, is understanding yourself, right? And it took me a little while to figure myself out, like into my mid-30s even. But having that good balance, understanding when you're stressed out, understanding what you need not to be stressed out. I personally think good physical fitness helps with the mental and emotional things. If you have issues, it's good to have a friend or someone to talk about, because when you keep things inside of you, they tend to just seem like they're bigger problems than maybe they are. But when you share with someone who you can confide in, whether that's a professional or a friend, it really makes a big difference. So that's sort of the mental and emotional piece. But it's really, I think, all about understanding yourself and what you need for self-care.
Thank you. And so we touched on this a little bit earlier, but I'm curious about your definition of an effective leader. And what does an effective leader or being one mean to you?
Again, asking questions, Energizer Bunny, and making decisions that need to be made that no one else can make. Those are probably the three things that you need to do.
Those are really great ESPN highlights. Thank you. So my last question is, what is your current morning and or night routine? And how do you bounce back when you've perhaps fallen off track?
Well, my routine, it kind of varies from day to day because I'm in what I call smorgasbord career mode. So my days are different from day to day, depending on which one of my smorgasbord activities. But usually somewhere in my day is some physical activity, whether that's yoga or walking or swimming or lifting weights or whatever, or stretching or, whatever. I don't watch a lot of TV. I prefer to read. My work is varied, so I like to cook. Usually I'll cook something once a day. So it's really, those are sort of the elements that make it. I do a lot of travel, so there's usually some involvement in going to airports and coming home from airports. But it's really a mix of stuff, but those are the elements I think that are pretty consistent across the days, regardless of whether some things happen in the morning or the night. It depends upon the schedule.
Wow, thank you so much. And all of this has been so insightful, and particularly the emphasis on physical fitness that you've placed, because I think with all the other things that you mentioned, if we take care of ourselves first and we make that commitment to ourselves, everything else seems to fall into place a little bit more. And getting that 4.0 seems to be less intimidating because we've built this self-trust in this other area of our life and this discipline. So we have more trust in ourselves to achieve the things that we want to do. So across everything that we've talked about, I'm curious if you had anything else to add on any of the topics, any other lingering thoughts?
Well, you commented on the 4.0. A 4.0 is not helpful if you can't work with people. You have to be able to communicate. You have to be able to work with people, no matter what degree you're getting, what profession, what job, what intellectual capacity. You've got to be able to work with people. And so putting yourself in environments where you learn those skills is a good thing. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Magnus. I'm so grateful for your time. And this interview has been a dream of mine for a while. And everything that you shared is so meaningful. And I hope that people listening listen to it a few times, because I know I've had the immense privilege of being able to sit in a conference room where you've spoken, or to have access through Georgia Tech. But there's so many students around the world who would be so excited to go to Georgia Tech, or so eager to speak to you. And I'm hoping that your advice in their ears helps them get through their current hurdles and in the future as well. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I've enjoyed chatting with you.
Thank you.